Hello and welcome back to the Hyperthesis podcast. We are now at episode 39, almost 40. My name is Pheely.
I'm Patrick.
And I'm Liam.
And we are back again. Today we are back with just us, so no guests. So just purely three of us. So that'll be nice. And today actually is Thai New Year. It's in April. Haha, so Happy New Year somehow.
Happy New Year.
It's the year 2566.
You guys are in the future.
Yeah. Well, I mean, our year counts in, flip on January 1st, but the celebration is now. Quite interesting how, I mean, Iranian New Year is in March, right? Like Persian New Year, because it's like first day of spring. Because to me, it's like, I wonder why in the West they use 1st of January, because like it's cold and dark and, especially in Canada, it's like kind of still cold. So I was like, okay.
It's like how a lot of like older countries that were established longer ago, they have these borders that kind of make more sense. They have borders that follow rivers or mountains, and then you look at like maps of the various like states in America, and they're just straight lines that people kind of arbitrarily drew on a map. That's what that reminds me of. They probably just arbitrarily chose January 1st for some unknown reason.
I guess, I mean, we used to have 13 months because we follow the moon. And one of them got scrapped off. It's kind of weird, isn't it? We are so used to 12 months. Imagine having 13, and each month is shorter because your moon phase is shorter than it's not exactly 31 days, right? Like or 30 days. So it's interesting to see how different culture go by time. Like the 2023 right now is based on Jesus Christ, right? Like. But 2566 based on Buddha, like it's Buddhist calendar, right? So because it's quite a bit older than Christianity. That's interesting to see. Anyways, let's move on to the intro topic. I have a short one today. So I was seeing this magazine I get every week. This is from September last year, but on the cover it has a photograph of Siberian Zen stones. I was like, well, what's so interesting about it? I was like, well, it looks like basically you see a rock or a stone on the lake, for example, just stone on a lake. But these stones are balanced on this really thin, like very thin pillar of ice. It looks impossible. So they compared it to Japanese Zen stones, which are people stack stones to calm their mind, to meditate or whatever. So this is what happened naturally.
Yeah, that was my question. I was going to say, does this just appear naturally? You answered.
Yeah, it has a very specific condition which are harder to find. That's why Siberia's Lake Baikal, I might butcher that pronunciation, is really perfect for it. So like, it's basically like a stone balanced on a thin stick of ice. Like how would that happen, right? It doesn't make any sense. So a researcher at Lyon University in France, I think he did some research on it, tried to recreate in the lab and was successful. So the meteorological conditions were that even though the lake has to be very frozen, imagine in Canada, what we have here is like sometimes you can skate on a lake, for example, right? And you can measure the thickness, but there you can throw a 10-wheeler on on the ice and it's still frozen. It's really thick. I think Canada has that too in the northern part, right? The permafrost, but this is like a big lake.
Or maybe in like Alaska too. I think they have there's a TV show called Ice Road Truckers or something like that. I've never watched it, but I've heard of it, and that sounds like they can drive on these really thick sheets of ice.
We have a lot of that here in Alberta, where they'll like go along a frozen river and essentially purposely flood the ice with water from underneath to make ice roads, and that's how they get like big equipment up to the different oil sands sites up north, and also how people can get to remote communities in the winter. It's very cool stuff.
So the condition then create this type of Zen stones is that it has to be always like under freezing, but there's no snow. So all the ice are from like the sublimation. And for what happened when there's no snow and there's a rock on it, so I think they call it the umbrella effect. So the radiation around from the sun would gradually melt the ice under it, but the part that's under its center of mass is covered. So it's like the stick on the umbrella, right? So what's ever left from ice being melted, gradually melted, is the little stick that hold up the rocks, which is not common. This is quite rare, but it's possible. They recreate in the lab where you get block of ice stick and put some IR or infrared radiation around it and try to melt the ice down carefully. Right? So there's no snow deposit or nothing, and you can see the same effect on some material.
I wonder if it happens there as well because the position of the sun in the sky. Because I imagine, like, if you have this stone on a lake, and if the sun's very close to the horizon, it's going to hit underneath. As the ice melts from underneath the stone, except this pillar, if the sun's really low to the horizon, it'll hit that pillar eventually. But if the sun's always really high above, then the pillar will kind of be protected underneath. So maybe that has something to do with it as well.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of things in nature, the rare things, right? They exist in certain places because very specific weather condition or meteorological conditions were required to have these. And what I think what's beautiful about it, if you never see it in nature, you probably like never, well, don't really dream of it or think of it, right? It's like, oh yeah, you know what? Anyone can balance things on ice like that. Yeah, but would it happen naturally? That's another question, right? And how it happens. So this kind of what's called mystique of nature. This kind of helps like humans intuit as to how things work. Basically, physics, right? Like we intuit of how things work through seeing nature, through seeing mathematics or whatever.
Mhm.
So I think this is an interesting thing to see people relate to Zenstone in Japanese Zenstone even.
Oh, it's just interesting looking at the position of Lake Baikal. I know it's also the deepest lake in the world, and it's typically frozen because it's in Siberia. But it's also at the same latitude as Edmonton, which is pretty funny. But yeah, it's eternally frozen, or it's frozen quite a bit. But it's a very interesting feature of Russia.
Very cool. Literally.
I do have another piece of news. This happened a little while ago, and I guess we haven't mentioned it yet, but they recently announced the new NASA moon missions, so the Artemis missions, which will return to the moon. And just, I believe last week, they announced the astronauts that will be in the first orbital mission of the moon. So instead of landing on the moon, these astronauts will be essentially going to the moon and back, the first time since the end of the Apollo missions. And it's really nice because there are 3 Americans. So they are Reed Weissman, Victor Glover, and Christina Hammock-Koch. And then we have a Canadian on board, Jeremy Hansen, who will be a part of the journey. So it's just really cool to see that a Canadian was able to get on board this first flight to the moon. And apparently it's in exchange for providing the Canadarm3, which will be used in the Artemis missions.
Is there a reason they're going to the moon? Because like before, even the first time for the Apollo program, the reason they go to the moon is not science, right? It's during the war, Cold War. What's happening is the race with the with the Soviets, right? The Russians. So it's like they didn't even have scientists on for a while, right? They didn't really, they weren't doing scientific exploration. They were just like, we need to get there to exert the dominance.
Well, I think there was always science in mind. Maybe not by like, the president of the America and, other people, but like I think the astronauts kind of had it in mind, and they did learn a ton from actually going to the moon as well.
But not for a while. They didn't send scientists like to do stuff for a while.
No, but they took like they learned things essentially by doing it.
I know a lot of the astronauts, if not all of them that went to the moon, weren't scientists at all. They were all, for the most part, pilots or fighter pilots, because that's what you need. Whereas now we are interested in the moon for science and also as kind of a gateway to the rest of the solar system. It's very challenging to get out of Earth's orbit and its influence. And you can listen to more about that in our previous episode about spaceflight. But we are going to be essentially using the moon as both a scientific interest and also as a gateway to places like Mars and beyond. So I know they want to put an orbital space station around the moon, which will kind of act as a stopping point to future moon missions. And it's a lot easier to escape the moon's gravity well than coming from the surface of the Earth. So it makes sense that we would go back to the moon, especially with the idea that we will eventually get to Mars.
It's like basically like a relay gate, right? It's like a gateway to space. So instead of going to, let's say, some big space stations that you have to build, I think it might be a good idea to, just stop by, get some gas on the moon, and because we have like a, place to sleep, and before the moon is not that far, right? It takes like less than a week to get there or something like that, and prepare, make sure. If you're like, okay, I really can handle a long trip to Mars, you're like, okay, because I know that. Okay, I try to go to the moon, and it sucks, right? So maybe it's a good way to like be like a refill base or something to test going to space. Because if you go to International Space Station, for example, it's all crammed, it's all tiny. You're in little boxes, like bunch of boxes. But if you can build a like relatively comfortable base on the moon that like in living quarters, test it out how to live in space, that'd be really good.
Yeah. Just to add in, so their mission is 10 days to the moon and back. So it's a total 10-day mission, which I believe is the same amount of time the first test capsule took, which was launched fairly recently. And also, I just want to throw out the idea of essentially orbital assembly. So along with getting to rest and make sure you're fit for space and fit for travel, there's also the benefit of essentially assembling a rocket in space. Now, this is something that we've kind of done with the ISS, and we're able to thrust it together to go into a better orbit or to avoid things, but hopefully we'll see things like assembling giant rocket ships in space that are able to take us to Mars and also provide the room that we need so that the crew isn't killing each other or going insane, which is a legitimate concern.
Well, I mean, like even for planes, some people prefer transits, like connecting flights, because you don't want to sit in a plane for 20 hours, and people are going insane from that, right? Like I can see that happening. Like imagine, I was like, oh yeah, trip to Mars. It's about 6-7 months, man. You're here with these people. Good luck.
Yeah, it's like imagine being locked in a closet with 1 to 3 other people for 8 months. It's like you'd go nuts, I think.
Definitely. I remember at St. FX, we had a guest speaker who actually was from the University of Alberta and gave a talk there when I went there. But he was essentially aiming to be a private astronaut. So we have our public astronauts, which are like the Canadian Space Agency or the NASA astronauts. But there's a new industry around private astronauts where they're hired by private companies to go to space. And so we had this person come in and talk to us about an isolation experiment that he took place, I believe, on some volcano in Hawaii, where essentially they were stuck with the same people in the same building for months on end and treated it like kind of a Mars habitat where they could only go out in spacesuits, so they couldn't actually go out, just even though it was on Hawaii. And they treated it like a true isolation experiment, which was really quite interesting to hear about.
Must be brutal. Yeah, what happened if you like really don't like the other person? It's like Oh shoot! You gotta reconcile somehow, right? Like you can't just uh, be super dramatic all the time.
There's an interesting book called Red Mars, which came out about 30-ish years ago now at this point, but it was a really good, accurate-ish sci-fi, but it features 100 people traveling to Mars altogether, which 4 people would be quite a lot. And mind you, the ship in this book has quite a lot more space, but imagine having to deal with 100 people every day for 9 months. That'd be a lot.
All right. So, shall we get to the main topic of today? So today we're gonna be talking about. I think as we mentioned about this before in previous episodes, so we talked a little bit about it, well, or maybe for a whole 1 or 2 episodes. But we are back at it again. So we're gonna talk about science fiction and some technologies that appear in science fiction, if it's makes some sense or if it's actually being realized. So anyone have any take on it?
Yeah, so science fiction is really interesting, and personally, I'm a huge fan of it. I don't know about you guys, but it's very cool to read and to see new technologies that might be possible in the future or are definitely impossible. And it's also fun to go back in history and see what the science fiction was historically and then see how far we've come today. Because science fiction has been around for centuries, if not millennia, dating back to Roman and Greek and even earlier periods. So there's examples of traveling to the moon, which is from Greek and Roman times, or there's some essentially myths or epic poems that talk about these fantastical devices that humans aren't capable of. For example, Archimedes' spheres, or the Vimanas that come from ancient Indian poetry, like the Hindu epic Ramayana, which is over 2,000 years old, mentions flying machines that have advanced weapons that could destroy a city. And so the idea of technology that's beyond our grasp is really embedded into human culture. And while those old examples might be more so myth or fantasy, they aren't quite classified as science fiction, but they have science fiction elements. And it's thought that the first actual work of science fiction is Somnium, which translates to the dream from Latin, which is from Johannes Kepler in 1634. So that's kind of seen by several notable people, including Isaac Asimov and Carl Sagan, as the first instance of actual science fiction. And this book just talks about what it would look like to view the Earth from the moon. So we've always had this fascination with the moon and with going to the moon. And that's something that within the past 60 years, we've actually seen people do. Just 4 years ago, we hit the 50th anniversary of the Apollo missions, but thinking that we've been dreaming of going to the moon for many hundreds, if not thousands of years, it's really cool that almost within our lifetimes, we saw someone go to the moon. And now we're seeing emerging technologies that are becoming more and more possible, like long voyages under the ocean, or people just flying in general. We see it as commonplace. We just talked about people hating to be trapped in the tube of an airplane for 20 hours. But it's so commonplace nowadays, whereas 100 years ago, it was a brand new technology still. I guess 100 years ago from now, it was a bit more commonplace, but 150 years ago, it was unheard of. So there are many technologies from science fiction that we've seen become possible, and it's worth talking about the technologies that are still in science fiction that aren't possible, but they might be.
It's interesting you mentioned Ramayana because it's quite old, right? To me, it's almost like the Greek mythology. It's the same kind of type. It's like because like it's weird in a way. It's looking at modern standards, right? All the gods and all these stuff. Like Rama is like an avatar of Vishnu, if I remember correctly, and it's about the journey of that through the what do you call it? The giants, like equivalent to the giants. You fight them, and there's a lot of unsavory things, or let's say immoral stories. It's like also the same in like the Greek tragedies, right? There's something that's like morally ambiguous or sometimes just wrong, just absurd. It's always in those old stories, and they all have this type of machineries or chariots that somewhat magical. But where's the word magical is kind of strange because what we use now would be magic to people 200 years ago, right? The fact we can pick up a phone and talk to another person across the globe, that's magic. The fact that there's a light coming out of your phone or your device or like something you hold and you can shine light, that's magic, right? Like because before it was like lantern. Everything is magic until you understood it. It's like even right now we have magicians. We should do tricks basically, right? They trick us, but they're honest about it. We do it for fun, right? But it's magic. But if you're a magician, you understand how it works. It's not really. You still feel like that's magic. You feel like it's tricks. So as sci-fi, right? Even things we see, it's like, man, maybe flying cars. Yeah, I'm like magic, but like we have them. We just call them planes. Um,
I think it was Arthur C. Clarke who was a famous author, but he said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, which is part of his 3 laws. We won't get into that, but yeah, it's absolutely incredible. I guess the magical things that we have just at our disposal and are so commonplace. Like you said, you could see someone who's on the other side of the world on a brick of glass that you're holding in your hand. It's really incredible.
I think one different thing about, I guess, modern day magic, like warp drives and stuff like that, is that we have the really good, well, I say really good, we have a relatively good kind of theoretical understanding of a lot of things. So I think some of the topics we're going to talk about today there's probably a lot. I mean, I haven't read your notes, Patrick, but I'm assuming there's a lot of Star Trek in there and warp drive and that kind of stuff, and it's something we can't realistically obtain right now, but we kind of understand the theory behind it. So it's less magical than people flying around on war machines 2,000 years ago. I think that's kind of like the way I'm interpreting it, though.
well, we think of like people flying around in space machines. We're like, whoa, that's magic, right? Like the Star Wars thing, spacecraft, like that looks like magic or pretty advanced science.
Well, let's get into some of these technologies then, because we know airplanes exist. We know we have rockets, we have submarines and cars and cell phones, but let's talk about a few things that we don't have, but we see in science fiction all the time. And the first one to start off with is teleportation. So you've seen it in Star Trek, in tons of TV series and movies and literature where teleportation happens. And that's someone going from one place to another instantaneously in some sort of device and being essentially disassembled and reassembled exactly or transported somehow over some method where they're able to appear somewhere instantly. So, as you said, Liam, Star Trek comes up a lot. It does. There's a lot of cool sci-fi in there. That's like the sci-fi TV series. And we see it happening a lot where people are able to teleport from, say, the Starship Enterprise to the surface of a planet. But we know that based on the laws of physics, we can't really have teleportation. Which, I mean, we can delve into it about why it's impossible, but essentially has to do with the uncertainty principle of you can't know the position and momentum of a particle, and so trying to recreate that is impossible.
Yeah, there's this thing called the no cloning theorem in quantum mechanics, where I don't remember the details, but I guess you can't clone things. And it has to do with kind of quantum states. It's like you can't perfectly know a quantum state and replicate it somehow, at least every single time. It has to do with probabilities. I don't remember, but there's a no cloning theorem. So if you can't clone a single quantum state, there's no chance you're gonna clone an entire human. I think.
I'm just put this out there. If one day they prove the one electron theory, anything would be possible, man. And also, I think teleportation might happen in a way that's not that way. So I'm thinking in a way it's like if you find a space-time curvature that connects two space, right? Like putting space far apart and curve it so it's really close together, and you just walk through it like a gateway. So you could say that's like a teleportation, right? Like, well, because you just go to one place to another place really far, but by just bending space time. I don't think that's too impossible. Well, it's less impossible than the normal teleportation, which is like I'll just put you there right away, right? But it's like warp drive, basically, right? But if you bend the space time so that point A and B is right beside each other, rather than far, you just pop to the other one.
Yeah, I mean, that's something else that shows up a lot in sci-fi are wormholes, which sounds pretty much what you're talking about. And while teleportation itself is impossible, wormholes could potentially be possible based on theory.
I'm not talking even like about like wormhole is a little different. I think that's an element um of like translation to it. I wonder if we can connect 2 points in space. Let's say it's like a door, right? A door is one of the greatest invention. Why? It allows you to walk through walls. Think about it. Like you build something, just a wall. Oh, you have to walk through it, and well, one could say it's like, well, what if you have a different the topology in either side, right? Like imagine this is a door basically. The wall is basically space time. Find a way to create a curved space time such that it acts like a door, right? Like so, it's not exactly warp drive or wormhole, but basically just put two space that are far discretely together.
Well, what you're describing sounds like the same way GR people describe wormholes, pretty much. I get what you're saying. I understand that like what you're saying is slightly different, but that's kind of the way they end up describing wormholes.
Yeah, but I'm just let's put a wormhole in the limit that what's called the translate what's it called traverse length is 0, right? You put the limit that, and it's like a really short
Yeah, so
wormhole.
from the person going through, from their point of view, it's like
Mm-hmm.
instantaneous, basically.
Yes.
But then from an outside observer, they've gone from one side of the universe to the other, kind of thing.
Yeah, because wormhole still takes time, right? Like, yeah, to go through the wormhole. But if you put a limit to this is really short, to me that's equivalent to teleportation.
This sounds like portal guns from Portal.
Yes.
Although I think Interstellar does a pretty good job with the wormhole because it is instantaneous, where they do kind of pass through it, but you can, like, light is passing through uninterrupted through the wormhole. So there's this sphere of light coming from the opening of the wormhole. And then when they go essentially past the boundary of the wormhole, it's still, I think, instantaneous, isn't it?
I don't actually know off the top of my head, but I don't see a reason why it would be instantaneous. It's all relativity. It's all reference frames. I think from your reference frame going through, time is still ticking, but I don't think it necessarily has to be instantaneous. And again, I guess it depends on your wormhole, right? And this is kind of what I was going to ask next. Is like how realistic are wormholes and warp drive and these technologies that you're talking about? If you realistically created a wormhole, I guess how long it takes to go through would depend on how much like energy you're putting in and that kind of stuff, maybe.
Okay, so when you reduce the length of the space-time basically to, well, the wormhole that traveled to 0, the like I said, it's equivalent to teleportation. In a way, that Patrick, I think, well, you said was in a portal gun. So it's like having the portal gun in Portal video game. And yeah, would you say that teleportation or just gates? I don't think that's. I don't know if that even like possible.
I guess it. Yeah, I think depending who you like that, I think that's one way you could define teleportation, and I think another way, which I think is the way Patrick meant, was like through entanglement. This whole idea that you measure state. Was it entanglement? Okay, sorry. There's no cloning theorem that I brought up. It has to do with entanglement and that kind of stuff. Um. Anyway,
And I mean, that is technically a teleportation that is physically possible, is quantum entanglement or quantum teleportation, depending on who you talk to. But this is something commonly used in quantum computers. I can't describe it the best, but maybe someone who studies or has studied quantum mechanics can. But essentially, no information is actually passed on. It's just kind of the recording of quantum states over a distance. But you can't communicate using quantum teleportation, and it certainly doesn't work like what you see in Star Trek, where people are dissolved um, and then reassembled somewhere.
Well, I think it is also you have to be careful what you mean by information, right? Like because some could argue that like our physical reality is just bunch of information. That like mass is information, energy is information. What distinguish things, right? Like I think noise of the theorem comes in super handy here. Like we have symmetry, like things we have conservation laws that happen to mass, to energy, to things that different from like let's say pure abstract information, which in a way the law that's governing it is not as well defined or clear cut, or we haven't figured it out. In terms of like let's say quantum information is follow maybe Schrodinger's equation and whatnot. There's the rules to them, and the rules to mass, the rules to energy. Like if we can transfer information well, let's say in quantum information, we can teleport it. Well, how would we apply that to the rules that we have for the quote unquote information of mass and energy? Well, if we know, we wouldn't be not having teleportation.
yeah. I like the way you think about things in terms of information, though, because everything just is information. That entropy episode we did at one point, that everything is entropy, right? Like,
And think about it, our perception, they are just information, right? I was having this thought. I was late at night. I don't know why I have this thought about AI. So I was thinking about like, well, how would you create true AI? Like in the sci-fi, for example, you see all these extremely intelligent AI, and how do people? I feel like going it in the not a wrong way, but the way that I don't think it would really work to create a true AI, because I don't think you can create it from humans. Like human can put like okay, you can create it from training from data from humans. That's my view, and here's why. The only way we know for sure that we can create true intelligence is through nature, right? Like that's what we are now. We are conscious, intelligent human beings. So why don't we try follow that path, right? We give our networks or whatever with some algorithm, but the data we train on, just give them nature, just pictorial, senses, auditorial, and well, how would you train it? Well, make it create a language model to communicate with another network, right? So it has to identify, let's say, it recognizes triangle, but what's the impetus for it to define triangle? Well, you have to define triangle. We could want to talk with another triangle. That is not talk with another triangle, another AI. This is how nature works, at least for us, at least in my understanding, right? Like when humans start like from our ancestors, or like ancestor of monkeys, right? The same common ancestor. We're like, well, we have to create language. We want to survive and talk about things. Like, oh, here's a tree, right? That's a tree. Okay, here's a tree. We define tree. We start to abstract, right? So, but AI right now we abstract for them. It's like, okay, here's the thing you need to look for, or like this pattern recognition. But the point is for intelligence to intuit, to come with them for themselves. And I think through that, like that's why I think ChatGPT is super important. Like language model, like is amazing. If true intelligence would create their own language model to talk to each other, that's what we do, right? That's how we intuit things. That to me, that's like, why don't we follow the path of nature to create AIs? For sure, it works. Then rather to find a new way that humans come up with, which may not work, but we know the nature's way work because we are here.
Yeah. I mean, that's another thing that's very common to see in sci-fi is kind of man versus machine and also the evolution of AI. That's something that's predicted to happen within the next couple decades is something known as the singularity, where an AI will be equivalent and then surpass human intelligence. And we might very well be seeing the starting of that now with things like ChatGPT, where, well, it's a chatbot in its essence, so it's not the most advanced thing in the world, but as we add to it and grow these models and they become more complex and more developed, and as we teach it more, like what you were saying, where, okay, that's a tree, that's a tree, that's a tree, as we do that more, then these models will become more and more advanced till then, I mean, yeah, I think the singularity will happen, and depending on which train of thought you follow and which kind of sci-fi you like, it's either going to be really good or not so great.
I think there's a move on like self-supervised learning. I think that's a really good way to go because like if humans is involved too much in like telling what they should do, then it's not real intelligence. If we can define some backpropagation or like algorithm to make it learn by itself, like it's basically coding your brain, right? Like, okay, this is how the brain's gonna work now. Let it run into all this data or all this all their own reality, and can it create itself? I think because also nature ways, sounds okay. I'm gonna say this is crude and slow, right? It takes millions and billions, millions of years for people to evolve to be us right now. But we can put all that and accelerate it using computers. The new iterations of the AI comes out in seconds, not for 30 years like humans, right? Like to get a new version of us, it takes so long. So we feel like we're so different from people 2,000 years ago. But imagine AI would feel like how much different from their prototype 10 seconds ago. That's huge, right? So this time frame of evolution is quite different.
Yeah, it's all about time scales, and turns out computers are a lot faster at doing things than we are. Um, one thing I always like, I played a lot of video games, I watched a lot of movies, and there's AIs and stuff in them, like Halo, Halo is Cortana, and in almost all these shows and movies, the AIs, I mean, spoiler alert, but the AIs almost always realize, wait a second, humans are awful, and they kind of turn on them, which is fair enough. I don't blame them, but I don't know if it's maybe a bad idea to kind of teach AI to learn in its own language in its own way without humans kind of being there to supervise it, because who knows, man? You never know. We get some iRobot stuff happening.
Yeah, it's just to comment on what Pheely was saying, though, it's interesting, I guess, the different goals, because for our creation of AI and like a computer based intelligence, we're looking at, I guess, speed, whereas humans, evolution favored efficiency. So these programs are able to write, say, an essay in a couple seconds, but at a much higher cost or a much higher energy cost than it takes us to write an essay, because humans are able to think and essentially do everything quite efficiently. We only need a pound or two of food a day. We only need about 2,000 calories a day, or kilocalories, depending on what term you use, but we're really quite efficient in how we operate and how our bodies behave, whereas we've sacrificed that efficiency for speed. So chances are, and I would be very curious to see if there's a number, but from ChatGPT and all the prompts and all the processing, how much energy is that actually using?
Just for the sake of time, I think we should talk about some other technologies, and I think a good one, which I'm pretty sure you were going to mention anyway, is again Star Trek motivated tricorders. Those are a really cool one that have actually kind of shown up in the real world recently. I think I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah, so tricorders, again, first appeared in Star Trek. Again, excellent source of sci-fi things. And they're essentially these very complex devices. So they're handheld devices that have many functions, including environmental sensors. They can record different types of data. They can do analysis and examinations. There are different types of tricorders that exist in the Star Trek universe. So you have everything from environmental tricorders, which can scan the environment on a new planet and tell you information about it, including composition, if there are life forms, that kind of thing. There are also medical tricorders, which will essentially diagnose if something is wrong by scanning someone's body. And then you have things like engineering tricorders, which, for example, on a starship, can give you information about what needs to be fixed, how it needs to be repaired, and all of that information.
I think as far as a TV show like Star Trek went, tricorders were a very nice way to further the plot without having to talk about, oh, this man's like without having a whole scene about how they look at this guy on the ground who's suffering because of like a bullet wound or something, or I guess a phaser wound, and you can just point the tricorder at him and be like, "Oh, his liver's damaged." Like, and it really furthered the plot quickly. And like the engineering one, they're like, "What's wrong with this giant complex machine?" You just point the tricorder at, and you're like, "Oh, yeah, it's not plugged in," that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the technologies that we see from science fiction are just plot devices. Everything from tricorders to warp drives, which means you don't have to watch like 100 seasons of them just traveling. And then also things like artificial gravity or AI. I think 2001: A Space Odyssey, the AI was like the main antagonist.
Well, I think we already have the tricorder. I mean, not into that capacity. We just call them our smartphones, right? I can point it at flowers and it tell me what flower it is. Now I can point at a dog and tell me the breed. Like I can point at things, tell like it show you where I am. Right? Like does a lot of things. To me, it's not just like okay, it's not about like one that can do everything, right? It connects to a network to this algorithm, these machines, or the internet, for example, that knows a lot of things. So in a way, we kind of have that. We just never expand its capability. I'm sure that people do like take pictures of your mold or like like your what's wrong with your body, right? It's like oh, you send to a doctor. But I think in China, there's like a booth you can go in and it just like diagnose you. It's kind of strange.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the way that everything is going, is just connectivity with phones. Like, for example, there was actually a prize for a company that could produce a tricorder. So that was the Tricorder X Prize. And so a company called Final Frontier Medical Devices, which is now known as, I think, like Basil Leaf Devices, they developed a set of health diagnostic tools that connected to an iPad. So you could like put a blood pressure pump or other types of sensors that were very compact, very small, and you could essentially get a diagnosis at home of what was going on with your body. And there have been a couple other developments, like NASA has a really cool system that was tested on the ISS that takes like 10 microliters of either blood or some sort of liquid sample and can tell you what the DNA is like, what the RNA is like, if there's anything wrong with it, virus loads, protein loads, just a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I think I read about there's like a graphene temporary tattoo you can have that constantly monitor your blood pressure and your pulse.
And I remember an old phone of mine, it was a Samsung device, but it could tell you your pulse and your blood oxygen, and I think they're even developing a method to figure out blood pressure based on like a light sensor in your phone, which is
I
wild.
think they have that already. I think the kind of newer Apple Watches, Apple Watches that just have light sensors on the back of them, and they have some other sensors too. But they can tell you your
They have IR. They have
yeah
IR, some kind of light shine on and it measure your blood oxygen.
yeah
Not even play blood oxygen. That's like
yeah. I
how?
know.
Like blood oxygen. Normally you have to do, I don't know what the procedure called. Like you have to go take blood from the arteries, not the veins where you usually get, which is hard to do because like most you see the blood on your arms, like they're all veins, right? The green ones on your arm are vein, but you have to find arteries, and so that process is painful and it's hard to find. Like you have to have experienced nurse or practitioner do it, but now you can do it with light. It's ridiculous.
And just to comment, we don't have blood pressure readings yet from it, but we do have like
Oh yeah,
blood oxygen and blood heartbeat.
yeah. That kind of stuff. But I'm sure blood pressure's coming up in the future.
Oh yeah, it's in the works. There's been some interesting research on it. But yeah, our phones, as they get more advanced, and especially as people get more focused on their health, like what we see with smartwatches and even like types of glasses or other possible implants in the future, then I mean, our phones are kind of becoming tricorders.
Yeah, like diabetes patients, for example, like 10, 20 years ago, that thing that attached your arm and stuff is like unheard of, right? At least for me, like I didn't know this a thing is connected to the smartphone. It's like, oh, your sugar level is low, sugar level is too high. It's like warn you and stuff like, and it's just like plugged in your arm.
Yeah, my friend's mom has one, and she takes like the phone and like just holds it up to the little device in her arm, and it just tells her on an app like what all the statistics and what the blood sugar levels are at and everything. The future is now. We are the world is very different than it was 100 years ago, let alone like 50 years ago. It's wild.
Just to kind of wrap up this topic of futuristic technologies, and a lot of which we have today, and a couple are actually physically impossible. Two things I want to talk about are warp drives and time travel, just to kind of wrap up this topic. Now, these are things that we do not have the technology for, and it might turn out that we will never have the technology for something like a warp drive, whereas something like time travel, well, congratulations, everyone. You are traveling through time right now.
Incredible.
Just not backwards. Yeah, so to start off, warp drives. Again, another thing from Star Trek, but also Star Wars and so many other different sci-fi works. And they are theoretically potentially possible in the form of an Alcubierre drive. And essentially this was a solution to Einstein's equations. If you want to hear more about those, check out a previous episode on general relativity. But essentially, it was done by Alcubierre in the 1990s, where he was like, okay, what happens if we manipulate them in such a way that we have essentially negative warping and then positive warping of space-time that's essentially able to accelerate space-time around some sort of device that's running this to be used to travel at faster than the speed of light, technically. And so these solutions, which are known as the Alcubierre metric, describe how space-time would warp around such a device, and then he postulates how such a device might be actually possible, and it involves the use of negative mass, also known as exotic matter, which might be a form of dark energy, and then it just gets hand-wavy. But essentially, if there is such a thing as negative energy, which he postulates could come from the Casimir vacuum, from the Casimir effect, which we've talked about previously, you could essentially source that, and using the energy equivalent of the mass of Jupiter, we could get a warp drive working, which is wild.
Yeah, it's one of these things where I don't think we'll ever realistically have one, I don't think. I mean, maybe in a million years if we're still alive as a species and all that, but it's one of those things where I think we could actually create a warp drive if we can figure out this whole negative mass stuff or negative energy, but we're never going to be using it on thing like macroscopic objects. We're going to be like, we created a warp drive for like an electron or something, and we transported it like over a distance of like a centimeter or something like that. Like those are, if we're ever going to make it that far, those are kind of like the first experiments that'll be produced, and they'll be very, I guess, not impressive to a general audience, but physically that's extremely impressive. And again, my field of study is analog gravity, so it's like things that mimic gravity, and there's all these extra systems as well. You can create in these ultra cold atomic systems, you can create things which mimic negative mass. So if you push it, it moves towards you. That's what a negative mass object would have. It's very counterintuitive. But in these analog systems, you can create things that do this, and they work at like you would expect from GR. So I think warp drive is something that's realistic. I mean, it comes from Einstein's field equations, and so do black holes, and so do everything else. GR is a very, very good theory. It's just a matter of, yeah, we don't have that much energy to be, flying starships around with wormholes and warp drive and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see where humans go. Not that we'll be around for it, but I guess that transitions into the final topic, which is time travel, which is in so many different movies. One of my favorites is Back to the Future, even though it's not really all that realistic because they say it could destroy the space-time continuum, but realistically, the laws of physics don't quite allow for us to go back in time.
They also use a unit of power called gigawatts, which is definitely not an actual unit of power, but I think that's one of my favorite things from that movie. I forget the exact number, but it's like 15 gigawatts.
1.21
gigawatts.
I don't even think the word, okay, this might trigger a lot of GR people, but like, I don't think the weights, okay, we think of space-time, it's like time in another dimension, really how it works. It is a good model to describe gravity and stuff. Sure, great. But I don't think it's how it actually works. Well, my argument is entropy.
Well,
there's no such thing as T minus 1. There's no such thing as the past. Doesn't exist. We only exist in the present. We can predict the future. We can have records from the past. That's our perception, right? That there's no such thing. It's not like space where it's like, there's space to the left, to the right. No, time is not, it doesn't exist in that topology that way. But you can make a model, you can pretend that it acts that way, and you can use that to describe as a model to describe gravity and space-time and whatnot. That's why I don't think time travel is even remotely possible, because it doesn't exist at all, because there's no such thing as time.
Well, that's a tough subject because I think many physicists who are better at their jobs than we are would argue against that. But it's, yeah, I see what you mean. You also get these complications when you're dealing with GR. I mean, GR is obviously not, the theory of everything, but it works better than everything else we have, essentially. And one example is you go inside black holes, you always hear people say time and space swap, and that's true. That's a mathematical thing. So there's more to it than that, but in certain kind of space times which exist and are real as far as we're aware, time acts like position and position acts like time, and I don't really understand it. And yeah, I think you're right in the sense that, entropy is the big thing, and you can't go backwards in time. And also, if time travel existed, we'd probably know because people would time travel. We'd be seeing people from the future.
Well, what I'm saying is that the concept of time we come up with is biased by our perception and by basically the physical reality that makes us think it's work this way. It's work as space. Okay, that's math. Let's do it. But math are models, buddy. They try to describe these things. They're models, right? Like that's why like metaphysics kind of like a finicky thing. You either believe certain thing or you don't. You can't prove it. You can't prove time it is linear or like curved. This thing. Well, there are effects that indicates that, right? There are things. There are things that have some evidence to support the model, but we all know models can be wrong. Are you saying there's no chance at all that GR is wrong? Right? There's a chance that time doesn't work this way. The fact that we have this space time thing, it just might be just like a mistake, but it's mistake that work really well, like a Newton's theory of gravity. It is maybe some people say, "Oh man, that he's wrong." Right? Yeah, in a way, he's wrong. But it's worked really well. Maybe GR is wrong, but it's worked extremely well.
Yeah, that very well could be. Well, GR is wrong on some level. We know that already, and so is quantum mechanics, but they're the best things we've got right now, so.
Well, this is definitely a conversation, which I'm sure will continue. But to wrap up the topic of sci-fi and the technologies, I mean, we've talked about a whole bunch: wormholes, AI, faster than light communication, and they're all in science fiction. Some of them might be possible. We're starting to see the evidence of things like more intelligence coming from computers and working to program that. We also see other things like proto-sabers, which maybe we'll have lightsabers one day. But just the fact that you can, say, video call your family who are on the other side of the world, it's still mind-blowing and magical, as Pheely said. And I'm really excited to see what new sci-fi comes out and then what's inspired by those sci-fi ideas.
So, to move on, before the story, I'll get Patrick to talk about how to reach us.
Right, so we have many, many different ways to reach us. Our first and primary method is through our Gmail account. So we are hyperthesispodcast@gmail.com. You can send us an email with questions, comments, concerns, queries, whatever you want. If you'd like to be a guest on our show, we just had a giant string of guests on our show. So if you'd like to also be a guest and are an expert or comfortable talking about your research area, we would love to have you on. Just send us an email. If you'd rather, we are also on Instagram. We are at the Hyperthesis, where you can reach out to us, slide into our DMs if you'd like. But we'll post episode updates, especially when we post some behind the scenes looks and also some memes, which I always like to pressure Liam to get on because his memes are spicy. If you are listening to us, chances are you have found us on some sort of platform, and we are on pretty much any podcasting platform you can find. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and really wherever you get your podcasts. We are based out of Spotify, but don't let that stop you from listening to us on another service. And feel free to like, comment, review, let us know how we're doing. And again, if you want to be a guest on our show, reach out to us. Oh, and check out our YouTube channel. Updates will be coming to that eventually. We're just working on the processing pipeline right now, but expect some more videos up within a relatively short time. I wouldn't say what it's relative to, but check us out on all our different platforms. And again, give us a review and reach out to us if you're interested in being on our show.
A relatively short time compared to the age of the observable universe.
All right, then we'll move on to the story for today. So who's doing the story?
Me.
So that's a story on real technologies inspired by science fiction.
Yes. So we already talked about this a bit. I guess we've talked more about like future technologies that might be inspired by science fiction, but I'm going to tell you it's not so much a story. I'm just going to kind of list off some history of actual technologies that exist in the real world right now inspired by science fiction. And I guess tricorders were one that we kind of talked about that cell phones and other medical devices already cover, but these I'm going to cover some other ones. Yeah, movies, TVs, books, video games, they've all impacted us, and a lot of these science fiction technologies from them actually show up in the real world, as we discussed. And on top of that, you actually get a lot of scientists that are motivated by these sci-fi TV shows and stuff. Like I've heard so many physicists start at their degrees because they watched Star Trek as a kid, or me personally, I played so many video games as a kid that were all science-based, and there were spaceships and planets and black holes, and that's kind of what got me into physics a little bit. So I think it's really cool how these things have impacted kind of our modern world today. Um, the first one, I'm going to tell you the story about, well, a very short story about Igor Sikorsky. Igor Sikorsky, which, if you know anything about airplanes, you've probably heard his name. I do not know anything about airplanes, so this was news to me. But a book came out called Robert the Conqueror, which was published in 1886 by Jules Verne, who was a prolific writer at the time. And in this book, it was about an inventor who created a gyrodyne, which is just a fancy way to say a helicopter. So this wasn't historically the first mention of a helicopter or a flying machine. There were some long before, kind of theorized in China, and then Da Vinci, of course, with his flying machine. But this book, this Robert the Conqueror, inspired this particular Russian-American engineer, Igor Sikorsky. And he eventually designed and flew the first viable American helicopter, which pioneered the rotor configuration used by most helicopters today. And then later in 1942, his work, with some modifications, became the world's first mass-produced helicopter. So this old book about a flying machine, a helicopter in 1886, actually inspired kind of the modern day invention of the helicopter. That's one kind of sci-fi. It's an older version of like what we talked about today, how Star Trek had warp drive in it, and that influences people to study warp drive. This is kind of an older version of that. Another one is a famous book by H.G. Wells called War of the Worlds, which might actually be one of the most famous sci-fi stories ever, which it was popularized by a radio show. So this story follows a Martian armada, which is invading Earth, and it arrives through interstellar transportation. And like I said, it obtained most of this fame through an Orson Welles radio broadcast, which actually sounded so realistic that many of the listeners actually thought the world was being invaded by Martians. And it caused actually a little bit of chaos in the world during its airing. For younger viewers out there like myself, been a few. I think there've been some movie adaptations of War of the Worlds, and one of them came out in 2005, which I think I saw at a drive-in when it came out, and I would have only been 8 at the time, so I don't know why I was watching this kind of actually gruesome movie as an 8-year-old, but some things slip through the cracks sometimes. Turns out there was a fan of this story, the American-born scientist Robert Goddard, who was particularly interested in how the Martians got to Earth instead of the movie itself. He actually became interested in space when he read this book at the age of 16, and he decided to study space travel. So he went on to actually create the world's first liquid-fueled rocket, which successfully launched on March 16th, 1926. And this actually ushered the era of space flight and innovation, which we've seen. And so it was the world's first it was the world's first liquid space rocket, essentially, which had a huge impact. And then kind of my final example, there's a whole bunch of other examples we don't have time to talk about, but my final example, which was inspired by sci-fi, it's actually the internet or the World Wide Web. The English writer Arthur C. Clarke, which actually Patrick mentioned earlier in this episode, he was a sci-fi writer, I guess. He came up with a lot of these sci-fi things. He wrote a short story called Dial F for Frankenstein. The dial is in like dial in a phone, and F is in Frankenstein. The story was centered around a host of telephone connections becoming sentient before turning its anger on humanity. So ties into that AI stuff we were talking about earlier a little bit. And a young English man named Tim Berners-Lee, Tim Berners-Lee, yes, Tim Berners-Lee, read the story and he enjoyed the idea so much that he spent his life toying with a similar idea. He attended MIT and he invented the World Wide Web in its early form, which was a bunch of telephone wires. So this just short story kind of was the motivation for the internet we have and use almost every day today. And those were some specific examples of scientists and engineers actually being inspired by stories, but there's a whole bunch of other examples of this, and specifically examples where maybe a particular person wasn't inspired, but something was predicted. So, for example, the credit card was predicted long before it was created, or cell phones and AI and all kinds of other things. But we won't get into them today. Maybe in a future episode. Who knows?
All right, thank you, Liam, for the sci-fi-ish story. Oh, I think we have a pretty good productive time. So, I'll talk to you guys next week and take care.
Bye, everyone.
See you later.